The tuck is an essential position to master if you want to continue to develop your handstand. In a tuck handstand, the legs will be pulling you towards underbalance constantly. So you'll be forced to develop the ability to resist falling towards underbalance by pushing even harder from the shoulders. So the strength and skill developed through the tuck is both helpful for general control in the handstand, but also for building the foundation for harder skills down the line, such as the pike handstand, which is basically just a harder variation of the tuck handstand, and the press to handstand, which utilizes exactly the same kind of strength. And further down the line, things like the one-armed handstand also requires a bunch of the exact same kind of strength that you develop through the tuck handstand. Now, obviously, to balance the tuck handstand, we need to keep the weight centered above our hands, or in other words, keep the center of mass over the base of support. There are three main ways of doing this. We can break the shoulder line and allow ourselves to planche. Now, this is generally not what we want, because planching will put more stress on the front of the shoulder or the front of the delts instead of on the trapezius or the top of the shoulder. And this makes a difference because it makes the strength gains from the tuck less transferable to other handstand specific exercises. And also, going into a planche position is usually, in most cases, not the most efficient way to correct underbalance. The tendency to planche is most often seen in people who are on the bit stronger end of the spectrum and who also tend to have slightly stiffer shoulders. So if you struggle to open your shoulders fully to 180 degrees, you might have to resort to a bit of planching to actually be able to get into the position. You can also arch your way into a tuck handstand, and it can be a quite aesthetic shape, but the reason why I don't recommend working the tuck handstand this way for general handstand development purposes is that it removes the stress from the upper trapezius, or the need to elevate the shoulders hard in order to be able to maintain the position. People who are on the flexible end of the spectrum in their shoulders and back will often have a tendency to get into the tuck position in this way and might struggle quite a bit to get out of this habit. But we would actually rather keep the back a bit flexed, just in order to put more stress and have to work harder with the elevation from the shoulders. The last way of getting into a tuck handstand is also the way that we generally want to do it, and it's by just purely elevating through the shoulders. So trying to lift the shoulders up towards the ear is generally a good way to cue this. If you take a closer look at the shape here, you'll notice that there is an almost unbroken line from wrist to shoulders and to hips. And the shape is actually leaning slightly towards the backside or the fingertip side in order to stay balanced. And it's the elevation from the shoulders that is pushing the shape into this slightly diagonal angle. For some people, getting into a tuck handstand will just feel very natural and they'll have an easy time doing it. There are actually people who find it much easier to first learn how to balance in the tuck handstand than in the straight handstand. Unfortunately, there are also a lot of people who will struggle quite a lot with achieving the tuck handstand with this specific configuration. Especially if you have a bit of stubborn shoulders, it's very common that you'll have a quite hard time developing the tuck. The good news is that you will also be getting a lot more rewards from actually working towards it. And my recommendation is to not think so much about the end goal of getting the deep tuck handstand, but more think about all the benefits and all the strength that you are developing just from working towards it. Once you reach a certain depth of your tuck, your back will have to start rounding a bit. The point at which this needs to happen will differ from individuals depending on anatomy, but it is something that at some point will need to happen in order to go deeper. As the back rounds, the shoulders will also have to move slightly forwards to counterbalance. This is also where you can see how similar it is to the press to handstand, because the shoulder mechanics are basically identical. And if you look at a very deep tuck, you can see that if we simply extend the legs, we'll be at the bottom of a press position. When developing the tuck, the wall is your best friend. Being able to hold a deep freestanding tuck requires a lot of very specific strength, and working with the wall allows us to take balance out of the equation and just focus on building this strength. When working on the balance component, it also allows us to get into a position we can balance from in a much more simple way, and will allow you to work with a much higher success rate than trying to just go straight into freestanding holds. The first exercise we'll look into is the chest to wall tuck slides. Now, this is a staple exercise for developing the tuck handstand. It will be useful for complete beginners and all the way up until the point where you'll be doing tucks so deep that your nose will be touching your knees. To set up, place your hands approximately an underarm's length away from the wall. Try to get your hips, shoulders and hands in one line and get into a nice posterior pelvic tilt. From this position, you're going to slowly and controlled slide your feet down the wall, and as you slide down, you're going to try to gradually elevate harder and harder from the shoulders. Only go as deep as you can without letting the shoulder angle close or arching the back, and then press back up with control, keeping your legs and feet light on the wall. Now, you'll want to try to push the depth of your tuck, but only as far as you can while maintaining good technique. So if you start to planche or arch, as you get lower into the position, you've gone too deep. Back out to a position where you can maintain a good position and just work from that depth instead. A few things to be aware of here. First of all, when I mentioned I want you to push taller from the shoulders as you go deeper into the tuck, it's the elevation of the shoulder blades. So pushing the shoulders up towards the ears is one way to think about it. For some people, it will work better to just think about trying to push the floor away or trying to lift yourself up towards the ceiling. But it's basically this motion we're trying to do with straight arms very, very intensely, and even more intense as we pull the legs further down the wall. Like mentioned earlier, this will ensure that we are placing stress where we want it, which is on top of the shoulders and in the trapezius region. If it feels heavy on the trapezius and the top of the shoulders, there's a very good chance that you are doing things right. And if it feels easy, there is a high risk that you are cheating your way out of it a little bit. You might also need to experiment a bit with the distance to the wall. Approximately an underarm's length is a good place to start, but you might still have to tinker with it a little bit. If you are too close to the wall, it will either limit the depth that you can achieve or force you to arch your way into further depth. Being too far away from the wall might also limit your depth, because having the legs more extended will make it significantly heavier to balance and to maintain the position. Or it might force you or give you the tendency to planche in order to achieve depth. The perfect distance is where you can keep good positioning and where the shins stay more or less parallel with the wall. It's a slight bit of a wiggle room, but that's pretty much what we want in the perfect world.
Now, if you find that you have a tendency to planche into the position,
First of all, I recommend reducing the height or the depth of your tuck to a point where you can actually control the shoulder position and keep it in the position that we want. But it can also be helpful to go a bit closer to the wall and you actually feel comfortable doing. Now, if you have limited shoulder flexibility, doing tuck work can actually help improve this because we're training the strength of the upper traps, and the upper traps are actually in large part responsible for pulling into shoulder flexion, and this is exactly the movement we are trying to do when we are in a tuck handstand.
if this is the best line you can manage, it's still alright and you can still get value out of doing chest to wall slides. Keep a strong intention of trying to open up the shoulders and elevate the shoulder blades. But otherwise, the most important thing is just going to be that as you lower your legs down in towards the tuck position, don't allow your shoulders to collapse even further forwards. Maintain the line and only go as deep as you can without worsening your position.
Just doing your chest to wall slides with this strong intention of trying to elevate and open the shoulders can be a potent tool for developing the active flexibility needed to actually do this with a better alignment and shoulders, hands and hips closer to being on a straight line. Whereas if you find that you have a tendency to arch, it can be helpful to think about, first of all, being very strict with really locking in that posterior pelvic tilt, and think you're almost trying to keep a bit of a rounded back while you are doing the exercise. You might also feel like you have to be just a bit further away from the wall than what feels natural. You can basically think of the chest to wall slides as the bench press of your handstand. So in your programming, think of it as a strength training exercise, meaning you can do it 1 to 3 times a week, and something like 2 to 5 sets generally works well. In the early stages, you might in the beginning only be able to do 1 rep at a time. But just like we would in strength training, the goal would be to, over time, add just a single rep from session to session if possible. And it can be beneficial to work all the way up to 5 to 10 reps to really get a solid base of strength.
Doing chest to wall tuck holds instead of the slides for reps can be a useful alternative or supplement to the slides.
If you're struggling with finding the correct position in your tuck handstands, and maybe you can't perform a lot of reps of the slides yet, doing holds, chest to wall tuck holds, will allow you to get more time in the position and allow you to accumulate more quality time practicing and getting a feel for the correct position. Again, you'd still want to keep the depth of your tuck to a point where you can actually work on the position with the correct technique and alignment. The chest to wall tuck holds can also be very useful if you are struggling to increase the depth of your tucks. So oftentimes just working on increasing the reps in your chest to wall tuck slides will be enough to simultaneously increase the depth of the tuck. But some people will run into the problem of being able to work up to quite a high number of reps, but not be able to really get much deeper in the position. Now, adding in some holds as supplemental work or as an alternative can be useful in these cases because it will give you more time in the bottom position to see if you can slowly, with more time, squeeze just a bit more depth out of the position. Doing back to wall tucks will also be worth your while, but the value in the back to wall tuck work is more so for building balance rather than for building the brute strength needed to hold the tuck handstand. So I usually recommend doing back to wall tuck work either as a supplement to your chest to wall work or as something that you only start doing after you've already developed a solid foundation of strength through the chest to wall work. But of course, there are some exceptions. Some people will have a much easier time finding a good position with their backs towards the wall. And in that case, it can make a lot of sense to use the back to wall work and, for example, performing back to wall slides instead of chest to wall slides to build the brute strength and use that as your handstand bench press. Now, before even worrying about balance, I generally recommend being able to stay in a wall supported tuck position for at least 20 to 30 seconds. So you're actually able to stay up for long enough to get some quality time when working on balance. Now, for building the ability to balance the tuck handstand, there are two reasons why I prefer the back to wall tuck work for doing this.
When going into a tuck from a freestanding handstand, it's useful to think that the feet are staying in line with my hips all the way down until my heels are basically close to touching my butt. Now, if I can go deeper, then from this position, I will start to pull my knees down towards my chest. And when going into a tuck handstand using the wall, I can do basically the same motion and find the same position.
The second reason is that most people will have an easier time getting their feet to float off of the wall and catch a bit of balance from a back to wall tuck position, and a harder time getting the feet to float off of the wall and catch a bit of balance in a chest to wall tuck position. But of course, there are exceptions, and generally speaking, I recommend people starting out getting a feel for the balance in whichever variation feels the easiest. For most people, though, that will be the back to wall tuck variations. To get started on working the balance, I recommend focusing on holds rather than going up and down like we do in the slides, just because we want to accumulate as much time as possible in a position that we can actually balance from. You want to set up with your hands as close to the wall as you can without having your head bang against the wall and without your butt pushing you off of the wall as you lower down. But once you've found your distance and you're up on the wall, you will want to push tall from the shoulders, posteriorly tilt the pelvis, and then slowly bend at the hips. Only go as deep as you can while maintaining good position, and then subtract about 20% so you have a bit of excess energy and are not struggling really hard just to maintain the position. Now, from this position, what you'll want to do is elevate the shoulders and then see if you can push your fingertips into the floor enough to make the feet light and maybe start to float off of the wall. Now, don't stress this. It's fine if your feet don't actually leave the wall in the early stages, as long as you are managing to make them a bit lighter by pressing your fingertips into the floor. You are doing quality work.
Resist the urge to use your feet to push off of the wall. This will only create chaos and not really help you in your journey to create balance. You're only allowed to use the pressure from the fingertips.
In the early stages of developing balance here, it can actually be helpful to think that you are chasing reps of small glimpses of balance.
Say you're able to stay up for about 20 seconds in your tuck position on the wall. What we want to do is see how many small 1 to 3 second balances we can accumulate in that time. And every time I go back on the wall, I get a chance to reset, elevate my shoulders, tuck my pelvis, and then push from my fingers once again to create another small bit of balance before returning to the wall.
The idea here is then to very gradually, over a longer period of time, increase the duration of these small holds until you are at a point where you can get some 5 to 10 second holds, at which point you can start chasing a bit more of these longer holds. Generally speaking, a good point of introducing chest to wall balance work is when you can do somewhat consistently 5 to 10 second holds at the very minimum in the back to wall tuck position. When doing chest to wall tuck holds working on balance, the cues that we discussed for the chest to wall tuck slides still apply. And one of the main things is also that we still need to find the correct distancing from the wall, which is approximately an underarm's length away, placing your hands that distance from the wall. But there is a bit of wiggle room and you will have to experiment a little bit.
Once I found my distance from the wall, I also need to figure out how deep a position I'll be working from. So if something like this is my max depth, you'll generally want to go 10 to 20% higher. So you're not working at your maximum strength capacity, but you have a bit of extra power left in the bank.
The way that we get the feet to become weightless on the wall and eventually float off the wall is through pushing through the heel of the hand, combined with elevating the shoulders even harder.
If you're managing to push tall from the shoulders and push through the heel of the hands, and the feet and knees are just becoming lighter on the wall, you're already doing a good job. If you push even harder, you might be able to get some small lift-offs and eventually straight up holds. And a way to make it slightly less heavy to get the feet to float off the wall is to first remove one leg, get your heels close to your butt as possible, and then from this position see if you can make the other leg become weightless as well. And maybe it's just going to start out with some small taps. That's all good.
Now, the way that we will build on the balance is exactly the same as in the back to wall tuck holds. The way that we would develop the balance here is exactly the same as in the back to wall tuck handstand. First step is getting to a place where you're able to just get the feet to become light on the wall. The next step is getting to a place where you're able to get the feet to float off of the wall, but then coming back to the wall. So finishing off with some thoughts on programming the tuck handstand. So you can start working on the tuck handstand quite early on in your journey, and it can make a lot of sense to do so. Again, think of it as the bench press that will build the brute strength needed for the handstand. Once you're at the point where you can stay up on the wall in a chest to wall handstand for at least 30 seconds, it's usually already a good point to think about incorporating some tuck work. So just to give you an example of how you would program this, let's imagine that you are training handstands 3, maybe 4 times a week. But just for example's sake, let's say you are training Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Remember that you can basically think of this as strength work, and we can also program it the same way as strength work, but we also need to recover just the same as strength work. 2 times a week generally works well. You can also do 3 times a week if you're able to recover properly. In the early stages, just doing 2 sets of 1 to 2 reps is a good place to start, and that might be challenging enough. Then to progress from here, again, this is strength training, so the programming is actually quite simple, and we are kind of looking to see if we can hit just a good old linear progression. So ideally want to add a rep to a single set each session. Alternatively, you can add a set instead. So just a set, for example, of a single rep. And especially when you're at the stage where you can only do 1 to 2 reps at a time, that might be the more realistic way to increase the total amount of reps per session. It's not uncommon that I have people go all the way up to 5 sets, and you could potentially go even higher. And we can even build some periodization into this. So you can think that you'll be working in blocks, and each block is 4 to 8 weeks. You'll spend the first block just focusing on building more reps, increasing the total amount of reps that you'll be able to perform each session and not worrying too much about depth, keeping that more or less constant. Then for the next 4 to 8 weeks, the next block, you will reduce the reps slightly and you will have a much bigger focus on trying to go deeper on each repetition. And here it can also be helpful to think, instead of just going up and down, then think that in the bottom of each repetition, you're going to stay for 3 to 5 seconds trying to go even deeper, but of course without breaking alignment. And in a lot of cases, you can just repeat this process until you will be able to get your knees to touch your nose. For balance work, you could also incorporate this quite early on in the process, but I do recommend just having a baseline of depth and strength before getting serious about actually balancing the tuck position. So a useful assessment to use can be to think that if you are able to hold a chest to wall tuck handstand with thighs at about 45 degrees and with the feet light on the wall for 20 to 30 seconds, then it's usually a good point at which to start getting more serious about working on the balance component. And a good place to start here is just doing back to wall tuck holds 2 times a week, and just as long as one of those days is the middle day, you are pretty much good whether you choose to do the other one on either the Monday or the Friday session. Focus more on quality and technique rather than time in the position. You are already building strength and accumulating more time in the position in the actual tuck strength work. And remember that there are different stages to balance. So first is just getting the feet light on the wall. Then we have the small taps or reps of balance, intentionally going out and catching a bit of balance and intentionally pushing back to the wall. And once you are getting that very consistent and controlled, we can start to go for actual longer holds of 5 to 10 seconds. As for the chest to wall tuck balance holds, if these feel good for you, you could basically start doing them alongside your back to wall tuck holds as soon as you start doing any kind of balance work. But otherwise, a good point to start introducing some chest to wall balance work is generally at the point where you are starting to get 5 to 10 second consistent balance in your back to wall tuck work.